Welcome to Stories of Slavery. In today's episode, we're sharing the story of Naomi, a black widow who gambled everything to rescue 57 children from bondage. People later called it unbelievable, even impossible, because the details were suppressed. Identities were concealed, and the reality was never supposed to come to light. This story is intense and tough. So pause, take a breath, and listen closely. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting me know which city and country you're tuning in from. Your support helps keep these stories alive instead of forgotten. Now, let's begin. In December of 1859, a woman simply disappeared from a locked room in Charleston, South Carolina. Her mansion had been encircled by the sheriff and 12 armed men. A detective out of New York had spent 3 years following her every step. The newspapers had already run the headline declaring her capture. Yet when they forced the bedroom door open, all they discovered was a cold fireplace, an empty chair, and a solitary sheet of paper resting on the desk. Scrawled on the note were 7 words that would haunt investigators for the next 100 years: "You count the dead, I count the saved." Her name was Martha Ann Price. The papers called her the Black Widow. They charged her with poisoning 3 wealthy husbands over 18 years. They labeled her a demon, a monster, a merciless killer who wed men for their money and dispatched them without remorse. But what stayed hidden, what wouldn't come to light for another 140 years, was this: Martha Ann Price had rescued 57 children from a destiny more horrific than death. 57 black children who'd been bought and sold like livestock. 57 souls destined for chains. 57 human beings who reached freedom in Canada, thanks to a woman the world branded a murderer. This is her story. Forget everything you think you know about heroes. In 1859, the American South was a society built on agony. By then, nearly 4 million black men, women, and children were held in bondage across 15 states. The cotton trade had revived slavery from a fading institution into the nation's economic powerhouse. In South Carolina alone, enslaved individuals made up 57% of the population. They possessed no rights. They received no protection. Legally, they were mere property, no different from a plow or a horse. Yet amid all the horrors of American slavery, one practice stood out for its exceptional cruelty. Even some enslavers found it hard to stomach: the sale of children. Enslaved kids as young as 5 were routinely torn from their mothers and sold to far-off plantations. They were advertised in newspapers like merchandise. Displayed on auction blocks, they were forced to open their mouths so buyers could examine their teeth. Their height, weight, and future labor potential were measured, then they were sold to whoever bid highest, sent hundreds of miles from everyone they'd ever loved. A healthy child between 8 and 12 could fetch $300 to $500 at auction in 1859. In today's money, that's about $12,000. Demand was huge, supply was endless, and the suffering was immeasurable. That was the world Martha Ann Price was born into, and the world she decided to dismantle. Born in 1825 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Martha was the daughter of William Price, a printer who secretly published abolitionist pamphlets, and Catherine, a seamstress who had helped at least 4 runaway slaves find refuge in the city. From her earliest memories, Martha understood slavery as an abomination. She grew up hearing stories of the horrors unfolding just a few hundred miles south. She learned to read through newspaper accounts of auctions and plantation atrocities. But knowing evil from afar is very different from witnessing it firsthand. In 1841, when Martha was 16, her father's printing business failed, plunging the family into debt. That same year, a charming young merchant from Virginia named Thomas Whitmore came to Philadelphia on business. At 28, he was handsome, well-spoken, and wealthy. He met Martha at a church social and was immediately captivated by her intelligence and beauty. Thomas courted her for 3 months. He brought flowers. He wrote poetry. He told her stories of his beautiful Virginia plantation, the rolling green hills, the peaceful countryside, the simple, happy life of the rural South. He never mentioned that he owned 47 human beings. He never revealed how he'd made his fortune. They married in September 1841. Martha was 16. She thought she was beginning a wonderful new life. She had no idea she was walking into a nightmare. The Whitmore plantation was in Henrico County, Virginia, about 10 miles north of Richmond. When Martha first arrived, she was struck by its beauty. The main house was grand and white, with tall columns and wide porches. The gardens were flawless. The fields stretched endlessly. It took her 3 days to grasp the truth. On her third morning as a married woman, Martha went to the kitchen to meet the household staff. She expected servants. What she found were slaves. Black women with scarred backs and hollow eyes. Black men who flinched when a white person raised their voice. Black children taught from birth never to meet a white person's gaze. Martha later wrote in her secret journal that the ground seemed to vanish beneath her. She'd known slavery existed. She'd read about it. She'd prayed against it. But she'd never stood 3 feet from a woman whose children had been sold away. She'd never looked into the eyes of a 12-year-old girl already whipped twice for moving too slowly. That night, Martha confronted her husband. She demanded to know why he'd never told her he owned slaves. Thomas laughed. Called her naive. The Underground Railroad wasn't a railroad at all. It was a secret network of safe houses, hidden routes, and brave souls who helped enslaved people escape to freedom in the North or Canada. By 1843, it stretched across 14 states, operated by both black and white abolitionists who risked their lives and fortunes to aid runaways. Hetty had heard whispers about it for years. She knew there were people somewhere in Virginia who could help, but she'd never found them. She was too old to run. Her remaining family was scattered. She'd given up hope of ever being free. But she saw something in Martha that night, fire in the young woman's eyes, the rage Martha had hidden for 2 years. She decided to trust her. If you really want to help, Hetty said, start with the children. They're small enough to hide. Young enough to start over. They need saving most. Martha asked how she could possibly save children from a man who bought and sold them for profit. How could she get them to safety without getting caught? How could she fight a system backed by law? Hetty looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something that would change Martha's life forever. You're a white woman married to a rich man. You can go anywhere. Do anything. Nobody suspects a lady in a fine dress. Use what God gave you before it's too late. In the spring of 1843, Martha made contact with the Underground Railroad. She did it carefully, slowly, using every ounce of her intelligence. She started by writing letters to old family friends in Philadelphia, asking innocent questions about abolitionist activities. She attended church in Richmond, listening for anyone who spoke against slavery, even in whispers. She visited markets and shops, always watching, always listening. It took her 5 months to find the right person. His name was Samuel Green, a free black man who ran a small barbershop in Richmond. Born into slavery in Maryland, he'd purchased his freedom at 25. Now 42, he was one of the most important Underground Railroad conductors in Virginia. Their first meeting was tense. Samuel didn't trust white women, especially not slave traders' wives. But Martha showed him her journal, the list of names, the children she'd watched vanish into the Deep South's nightmare. And she told him exactly what she wanted to do. I can't save everyone, she said. But I can save some. The children. I can get them out before my husband sells them south. Samuel studied her for a long time. Then he asked a question that would define everything that followed, and your husband? What happens when he notices his property keeps disappearing? Martha looked at him with eyes gone cold and hard. She'd thought about this for months. Prayed over it. Wrestled with her conscience and faith. And she'd reached a conclusion that would have shocked her younger self. My husband, she said slowly, is not a good man. And bad things happen to men who aren't good. The first child Martha saved was a 9-year-old boy named Isaiah. Thomas had purchased him from a Charlottesville farm and scheduled to sell him to a Mississippi trader in 2 weeks. Isaiah had watched his mother collapse at the sale. He'd been dragged away screaming while she begged on her knees for mercy that never came. Martha smuggled him out on a Sunday morning in June 1843. She hid him in a false-bottomed vegetable cart driven by Peter, a free black farmer who worked with the Underground Railroad. Peter drove north toward Washington, D.C., where another conductor took over. From there, Isaiah was passed from safe house to safe house, traveling only at night, hiding in barns, cellars, and secret rooms. 43 days after Martha lifted him from that cabin, Isaiah crossed into Canada. Given a new name and identity, he grew up to become a teacher. He married and had 5 children. He lived to see slavery abolished, and never knew the white woman who'd saved him. After Isaiah, there was no turning back. Martha had committed a crime punishable by years in prison. She'd betrayed her husband, violated every law of Virginia, and she'd never felt more alive. Over the next 2 years, Martha saved 12 more children from her husband's holding cabin. She developed a careful system. She waited until Thomas was away on business. She drugged the overseer's coffee with laudanum, a common opiate easily obtained from any pharmacy. She moved quickly, always at night, using different routes and conductors. She kept her secret so closely that even Hetty didn't know the full extent. Then, in the winter of 1845, Thomas Whitmore fell ill. The official cause of death was listed as typhoid fever. The attending doctor found nothing unusual, symptoms consistent with the disease: high fever, abdominal pain, bloody diarrhea, confusion, and finally death. Typhoid was common in Virginia back then. Thousands died from it yearly. There was no reason to suspect foul play. But there was no typhoid in the Whitmore household. The water was clean. The food fresh. No one else on the entire plantation showed any sign of illness. Because Thomas Whitmore didn't die of typhoid. He died of arsenic poisoning. Arsenic was easy to get in 1845. Sold openly in pharmacies as rat poison. Used in medicines, cosmetics, household products. In small doses over several weeks, it produced symptoms almost identical to typhoid: stomach pain, vomiting, diarrhea, confusion, death. The poison accumulated slowly. By the time the victim became seriously ill, it was too late. Martha had been slipping arsenic into her husband's coffee for 3 weeks before he died. She'd calculated the doses carefully, increasing them gradually so his death would appear natural. She'd watched him suffer and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. This was the man who'd sold 31 children into bondage. Destroyed countless families without hesitation. Saw human beings as property to be bought and sold. She didn't consider it murder, she considered it justice. Thomas Whitmore died on February 14, 1845. He was 32. Martha inherited everything: the plantation, the land, the money, and the 47 enslaved people who'd been her husband's property. Within 6 months, all 47 were gone. Martha didn't sell them, she freed them. She forged documents showing Thomas had freed them in his will. Paid bribes to local officials to ensure the papers were accepted. Gave each person travel money and connected them with Underground Railroad conductors who could help them reach the North or Canada. But Martha knew she couldn't stay in Virginia. Questions were being asked. Some of Thomas's business partners were suspicious about the sudden liberation of valuable property. Rumors spread about the young widow who seemed far too calm at her husband's funeral. In December 1845, Martha sold the Virginia plantation and moved to Charleston, South Carolina. She was 20 years old, wealthy, widowed, and completely free for the first time in her life. She'd saved 13 children and freed 47 enslaved people. But she was just getting started. In 1846, Charleston was the beating heart of the American slave trade. The city's economy depended almost entirely on buying and selling human beings. Auctions were held multiple times weekly at various locations. Traders came from across the South to deal in human merchandise. The children's market was particularly active. Martha arrived as a wealthy widow with excellent social connections. Her story was simple: she'd married a Virginia planter who died of fever, and she sought a fresh start. She joined the right churches, attended the right parties, befriended the wives of South Carolina's wealthiest men. And she watched. For 2 years, Martha observed the Charleston slave trade with the same careful attention she'd once given her husband's operations. She learned the biggest traders' names, studied their methods, identified the routes they used to transport enslaved people to deep South cotton plantations. And she began developing a plan far more ambitious than anything she'd attempted before. In 1847, Martha met her second husband. His name was Edward Blackwell. 45, never married, and one of the wealthiest slave traders in South Carolina. He owned a massive compound outside Charleston where he held enslaved people before auction. At any given time, 100 or more men, women, and children were locked in his barracks, awaiting sale. Edward was cruel, greedy, and completely without conscience. He was also completely captivated by Martha. They married in September 1847. Martha was 22. She moved into his mansion and gained access to his entire operation. And once again, she began to plan. Edward's slave compound was heavily guarded, with armed overseers on patrol at all hours. The barracks were locked with heavy chains. Escape was impossible without outside help. Smuggling them out the way she'd done in Virginia wouldn't work. But the children were treated differently. Because young kids were harder to control and needed more care, Edward kept them in a separate building closer to the main house. Usually, 10 to 20 children were there at any time, ages 5 to 12. They were watched by 2 enslaved caretakers, but no armed guards. Edward didn't consider children a flight risk. Where would they go? What could they do? That was his mistake. Martha spent her first 6 months as Edward's wife, gaining his trust and studying every aspect of his operation. She learned which overseers were lazy and which were vigilant. Discovered which nights Edward drank heavily and fell into deep sleep. Identified a network of free black workers and Underground Railroad conductors in the Charleston area who could help move children to safety. In March 1848, she made her first move. 3 children were in the holding building that night, 2 girls aged 7 and 9, and an 11-year-old boy. Martha had drugged Edward's whiskey with laudanum. At 2 a.m., she slipped out and met Peter, the same farmer who'd helped her in Virginia. He'd traveled hundreds of miles to assist again. The escape went smoothly. Martha unlocked the building with a key she'd secretly copied weeks earlier. She woke the children and told them to stay silent. Peter loaded them into a hidden wagon compartment, and they vanished into the night. Those 3 children reached Canada 7 weeks later. They were the first of many. Over the next 4 years, Martha smuggled 26 children out of Edward Blackwell's compound. She developed an elaborate system of signals, safe houses, and trusted conductors. She timed operations carefully, never taking unnecessary risks. She kept meticulous records in a coded journal hidden in a secret compartment in her bedroom wall. Edward never suspected a thing. When children disappeared, he assumed they'd died or been stolen by rival traders. He'd increase security for a few weeks, then relax again. He trusted his young wife completely. She was beautiful, charming, and seemed uninterested in his business. But in April 1852, Edward Blackwell began to grow sick. Symptoms started slowly: stomach cramps, nausea, fatigue. Edward assumed something he ate. A doctor prescribed rest and a bland diet, but the symptoms worsened. By June, Edward could barely leave his bed. His skin had a grayish pallor. His hair fell out. He'd lost 30 pounds. Doctors were baffled, diagnosed a mysterious wasting disease and predicted he wouldn't survive the summer. Edward Blackwell died on July 17, 1852. He was 50. The cause of death was listed as unknown illness. No autopsy. No suspicion of poison. Martha inherited everything. Once again, she worked quickly after her husband's death. She couldn't free all the enslaved people without raising suspicion. Too many, too valuable. Questions would follow. So she took a different approach. She sold the compound and its inventory to a Mississippi trader known for brutal treatment. But before the sale was finalized, she arranged for 11 more children to disappear. She bribed guards. Falsified records. Got those children to the Underground Railroad before anyone realized they were missing. By the time the new owner took possession, the 11 children were already on their way to Canada. The discrepancy was blamed on record-keeping errors. No one investigated further. Martha left Charleston in fall 1852. She'd been in the city 6 years, saved 39 children, and killed one of the largest slave traders in South Carolina, with no one suspecting her of anything except being a tragic widow who'd lost 2 husbands too young. She moved to Savannah, Georgia. She was 27, with a fortune at her disposal, ready to continue her work. Savannah in the 1850s was another major hub of the Southern slave trade. Sitting at the mouth of the Savannah River, it provided easy access to coastal and inland routes for transporting enslaved people. Traders came from across the region to buy and sell at the city's famous markets, and once again, children were among the most valuable commodities. Martha arrived with a carefully crafted story, a wealthy widow from Charleston seeking peace and quiet after her beloved husband's death. She bought a beautiful house in one of the finest neighborhoods. Attended church every Sunday. Donated generously to local charities. She became known as a kind, gentle woman who kept to herself. For 2 years, Martha didn't remarry. She used this time to establish new Underground Railroad connections in Georgia. She identified the major players in the local slave trade. Studied their operations, schedules, weaknesses. She was preparing for her most ambitious operation yet. In 1854, she met Marcus Holland. Marcus was different from her previous husbands. Younger, only 32, and from an old Georgia family with deep roots in the cotton trade. He didn't deal in slaves directly but owned 3 large plantations where hundreds of enslaved people worked growing cotton for export. He was charming, educated, widely respected in Savannah society. He was also a monster. Known among the enslaved for his particular cruelty, separating families as punishment for minor infractions, selling children away from their mothers whenever he needed quick cash. He believed fear was the only effective tool for controlling enslaved people, and used it without mercy. Martha married him in June 1855. She was 30. For the next 4 years, she waged a secret war against him from inside his own home. The Holland plantations were about 20 miles outside Savannah. Marcus spent most of his time at the largest one, overseeing operations. Martha was expected to stay at the Savannah house, playing the perfect Southern wife, hosting parties, managing the household, producing children. She did none of those things. Instead, Martha used her position to gain access to every aspect of Marcus's operations. She visited the plantations regularly, claiming she wanted to understand her husband's business. She brought gifts for the enslaved children, small toys, pieces of candy, books she pretended were just for show. She earned their trust slowly, carefully, never pushing too hard. And she identified the children she could save. Logistics were much more difficult. The plantations were isolated. Security tighter. The journey to the nearest Underground Railroad station longer and more dangerous. But Martha had years of experience now. She knew what she was doing. Between 1855 and 1859, Martha smuggled 18 children off the Holland plantations. She used a variety of methods, hiding them in supply wagons, disguising them as free black children traveling with their parents, bribing overseers to look the other way. Some escapes took months to plan, others came together in days when unexpected opportunities arose. 18 children made it to Canada. 18 children who should have spent their lives in bondage. 18 families who would never know who saved them. Then, in the summer of 1859, Marcus Holland began to grow sick. By now, Martha had perfected her method. She knew exactly how much arsenic to use, how to administer it without detection, how to play the worried wife while her husband slowly died before her. Marcus's illness followed the same pattern: stomach pain, vomiting, weakness, hair loss, skin discoloration. Doctors diagnosed a mysterious wasting disease, tried various treatments, nothing worked. Marcus Holland died on September 3, 1859. He was 37. He left behind 3 plantations, 800 enslaved people, and a widow who had just committed her 3rd murder. But this time, something was different. This time, someone was watching. His name was William Foster, a private detective from New York City who specialized in investigating suspicious deaths among wealthy families. He'd been hired by Marcus Holland's brother, James, who stood to inherit part of the estate and had never trusted his brother's northern wife. Foster had been investigating Martha for 3 months before Marcus died. He dug into her past, discovered the deaths of her 2 previous husbands, found patterns that couldn't be coincidence. 3 husbands, 3 wealthy men, 3 mysterious illnesses, 3 fortunes inherited by the same woman. Foster knew he was looking at a serial killer. But he needed proof. So, in fall 1859, the detective began closing in on Martha and Price. William Foster didn't believe in coincidences. In 23 years as a private detective, he'd learned that when something looked suspicious, it usually was. And Martha and Price looked very suspicious indeed. Foster had started investigating in August 1859, weeks before Marcus Holland died. James Holland contacted him with concerns about his sister-in-law. James had never liked Martha, found her too quiet, too watchful, too controlled. When his brother grew ill, James remembered rumors about Martha's previous husbands. Whispers in Charleston society about the young widow whose husbands kept dying. So he hired the best detective he could find. Foster began in Virginia, where Martha's first husband had died 14 years earlier. He spoke to neighbors who remembered the Whitmore plantation. Tracked down former business associates of Thomas Whitmore. Found an old doctor who'd treated Thomas in his final days and had always wondered about the unusual progression of his symptoms. The doctor, Henry Crawford, was 72 now, retired and living with his daughter in Richmond. When Foster showed up asking about a death from 1845, Crawford was surprised but willing to talk. "I always thought there was something wrong about that case," he told the detective. "Typhoid fever doesn't usually progress the way his did. Symptoms were close, but not quite right. I mentioned it to the local magistrate, but he wasn't interested. The widow was respectable, no reason to suspect foul play." Foster asked what Crawford thought had actually happened. The old doctor hesitated, then said a single word: poison. From Virginia, Foster traveled to Charleston. He spent 3 weeks digging into the death of Edward Blackwell, Martha's second husband. The case was harder, more time had passed, many witnesses had died or moved away. But Foster was patient. He interviewed former servants. Found old business records. Tracked down the doctor who'd treated Edward in his final months. The pattern was unmistakable. Edward Blackwell had died of the same mysterious wasting illness as Thomas Whitmore. Identical symptoms, progression, outcome. 2 husbands, 2 fortunes, 2 mysterious deaths, and now a third husband dying in Savannah. Foster rushed back to Georgia, hoping to arrive before Marcus Holland died. He wanted to observe Martha's behavior, examine the sick man himself, gather evidence before it was too late. He arrived on September 1, 1859. Marcus Holland died 2 days later. Foster attended the funeral. He watched Martha play the grieving widow with perfect composure, wearing black, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, accepting condolences from hundreds of mourners, and never showing a trace of genuine emotion. After the funeral, Foster approached James Holland with his findings. He explained the pattern, laid out evidence of 3 suspicious deaths, told James he believed Martha had murdered his brother and her 2 previous husbands. James was horrified but not surprised. He'd suspected something was wrong from the beginning. Now he wanted justice. "What do we do?" James asked. "How do we prove it?" Foster told him they'd need to move carefully. They couldn't accuse a respectable white widow without solid evidence. They needed physical proof. "We need to exhume the body," Foster said. "If your brother was poisoned with arsenic, traces will remain. A proper examination will reveal the truth." James agreed. He contacted local authorities and requested an exhumation, a process that would take weeks to arrange. Meanwhile, Foster continued investigating, looking for any additional evidence. That's when he discovered something that changed everything. While searching old Charleston records, Foster found a discrepancy in Edward Blackwell's slave inventory. According to records from 1852, Edward owned 117 enslaved people at the time of his death. But when the estate was sold, only 106 were accounted for. 11 people had vanished. Foster dug deeper. He found similar discrepancies in Marcus Holland's records, enslaved people on earlier inventories missing from later ones. Children mostly, always children. At first, Foster assumed these missing people had been sold quietly or died without proper documentation. Record keeping in the slave trade was notoriously poor. But as he investigated, he noticed a strange pattern. The disappearances always occurred while Martha was present, always involved children between 5 and 14, and always happened shortly before the husband died. Foster didn't know what to make of it. Was Martha selling children secretly and pocketing the money? Running some kind of fraud? He couldn't understand what a wealthy white woman would gain from stealing enslaved children. But he filed the information away, knowing it might prove useful later. In October 1859, Foster received permission to exhume Marcus Holland's body. The examination was conducted by Dr. Samuel Morrison, a respected physician from Atlanta. Using the Marsh test, a chemical procedure developed in 1836 specifically for detecting arsenic, Dr. Morrison analyzed samples from the deceased's hair, fingernails, and internal organs. The results were conclusive. Marcus Holland's body contained lethal levels of arsenic. He'd been poisoned over several weeks before his death. No doubt about it. Foster now had the proof he needed. He presented his findings to Savannah authorities, along with evidence linking Martha to similar deaths of her two previous husbands. The local sheriff, Robert Jennings, was initially skeptical. Martha was a respectable member of Savannah society, donated generously to his re-election campaign, attended the same church as the mayor's wife. But the evidence was overwhelming. On November 15, 1859, Sheriff Jennings agreed to arrest Martha on suspicion of murder. The plan was simple: assemble a group of deputies, surround Martha's mansion on Abercorn Street at dawn when she'd likely be asleep, knock, present the warrant, and take her into custody without incident. Straightforward. It was anything but. Martha had been preparing for this moment for months. She'd known from the day Foster arrived that someone was investigating her. She had sources throughout the city, people who owed her favors, who'd helped with the Underground Railroad and kept her informed of threats. She knew about the exhumation. Knew about the arsenic test. Knew it was only a matter of time before they came for her. And she'd made her plans accordingly. On the night of November 14, 1859, Martha sat alone in her study with a glass of wine and her journal. She'd spent the previous week settling affairs, burning any documents that could incriminate her Underground Railroad associates, and ensuring that the final group of children she'd saved were safely on their way to Canada. 6 children in that final group, 2 boys and 4 girls. They'd left the Holland plantation 3 weeks earlier, hidden in a shipment of cotton bales heading north. By now, they should be crossing into Pennsylvania. By month's end, they'd be in Canada. Free. Martha had kept a careful count over the years. She knew exactly how many children she'd saved: 57. 57 children who should have grown up in chains. 57 who should have been worked to death in cotton fields or sugar plantations. 57 given a second chance at life because of what she'd done. She wrote the number in her journal. Then she closed the book and prepared for what was coming. At 4 a.m. on November 15, Sheriff Jennings and 12 armed deputies surrounded Martha's mansion. They blocked every exit. Positioned men at every window. Ensured no possible escape route. At 4:30, the sheriff approached the front door and knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Finally, on his orders, 2 deputies broke down the door. They rushed in with weapons drawn, expecting a desperate woman ready to fight or flee. Instead, they found an empty house. The deputies searched every room, every closet, every corner. Nothing. No sign of Martha, no sign of any servants. The house had been completely abandoned. In the study, on a desk by the window, they found a single sheet of paper with 7 words written in elegant handwriting: "You count the dead. I count the saved." Beneath the note was a leather journal filled with coded entries, strange symbols and numbers that made no sense to anyone who found them. Martha and Price had vanished. The search lasted months. Sheriff Jennings sent telegrams to law enforcement agencies across the South. Wanted posters were printed and distributed throughout Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia. A $5,000 reward was offered for information leading to her capture. No one ever found her. Some witnesses claimed to have seen a woman matching Martha's description boarding a ship in Savannah Harbor on the night of November 14. The ship was bound for New York. By the time investigators tracked it down and interviewed the crew, the woman had long since disappeared. Others claimed Martha had never left the South at all. Reports surfaced of a mysterious woman helping enslaved families escape through Georgia swamps. Whispers of a white woman dressed in men's clothing leading groups of runaways to secret Underground Railroad stations. Stories grew stranger and more fantastic with each telling. The truth was, no one knew what had happened to Martha and Price. She'd simply vanished like smoke in the wind. William Foster spent the next 2 years searching for the Black Widow. He traveled across the country following leads that went nowhere, interviewing witnesses who couldn't agree on anything. The case consumed him, became his obsession. But somewhere along the way, Foster's investigation took an unexpected turn. While reviewing the evidence for the 100th time, Foster finally cracked the code in Martha's journal. It took months of work, comparing entries with dates and locations, cross-referencing names and symbols. Eventually, the patterns became clear. The journal was not a record of murders. It was a record of rescues. Each entry documented a child saved from slavery, names, ages, dates, destinations. The entries stretched back to 1843, beginning with a 9-year-old boy named Isaiah, smuggled out of Virginia. They continued through the Charleston years, through the Savannah years, right up to November 1859. 57 entries in total. 57 children. Foster sat alone in his office, staring at the journal, trying to process what he'd discovered. He'd spent 2 years hunting a murderer. But now he understood that the woman he'd been chasing was something far more complicated, something he'd never encountered before. Martha and Price had killed 3 men. That was true. She was a poisoner, a cold-blooded murderer who'd eliminated her husbands without mercy or remorse. But she'd also saved 57 children from a fate worse than death. She'd risked everything, fortune, freedom, life, to rescue innocent souls from bondage. She'd used her position as a wealthy white woman to infiltrate the very heart of the slave trade and tear it apart from inside. Foster didn't know what to do with this information. He'd been hired to find a killer. He'd found something far more complex than simple guilt or innocence. In the end, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He closed the case. He told James Holland that Martha had escaped and would likely never be found. He returned the journal to his files and never spoke of its contents to anyone. He destroyed the notes revealing the coded entries. He let the Black Widow disappear into history. Years later, when asked why he'd given up the search, Foster would only say that some mysteries were better left unsolved. The Civil War began 18 months after Martha vanished. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, the same city where Martha had once lived as a slave trader's wife. The war would last 4 years, cost more than 600,000 lives, destroy the Southern economy, and tear the nation apart. But it would also end slavery forever. On January 1, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all enslaved people in Confederate states free. 2 years later, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the entire United States. 4 million Black Americans were finally, legally, permanently free. Martha and Price did not live to see this day. Or if she did, she never revealed herself. There were rumors, of course, there were always rumors. Some claimed she'd moved to Canada and lived out her days among the freed slaves she'd helped rescue. Others said she'd gone to England, reinvented herself as a respectable widow, and never spoke of her past. A few imaginative souls insisted she'd returned to the South after the war, walking freely through cities where she'd once been a fugitive. None of these stories were ever confirmed. The Black Widow of 1859 remained a mystery. But the children she saved did not remain mysteries. They grew up. They married. They had families of their own. They built lives in freedom that would have been impossible without a stranger's intervention. In 1892, a church in Toronto, Canada, conducted a survey of its congregation. Among the members was an elderly man named Isaiah Freeman, 92 years old, born into slavery in Virginia but living in Canada since he was 9. When asked how he'd escaped, Isaiah said he didn't know. He'd been taken from a cabin in the middle of the night by people whose faces he never saw. Passed from stranger to stranger until he reached freedom. He never learned the name of the person who'd saved him. But he'd spent his entire life trying to pay that gift forward. Isaiah became a teacher. He educated hundreds of Black children over 60 years. Helped establish schools, churches, and community organizations throughout Ontario. Married and raised 7 children, all of whom had children of their own. By his death in 1897, his family numbered more than 40, all free, all educated, all contributing members of their communities. And Isaiah was just one of the 57. In 1947, a historian named Dr. Ella Wright was researching the Underground Railroad for her doctoral dissertation at Howard University. While examining old church records in Philadelphia, she discovered a box of documents donated anonymously in 1902. The box contained letters, journals, and other papers related to abolitionist activities in the mid-19th century. Among them was a leather journal with coded entries and strange symbols on every page. Dr. Wright spent 3 years decoding the journal. What she found changed everything historians knew about the Underground Railroad and resistance to slavery. The journal documented not only the 57 children saved by Martha and Price, but also the network of conductors, safe houses, and supporters who'd helped her. It revealed the names of free black men and women who'd risked their lives to transport children to safety. Identified white abolitionists who'd provided money, shelter, and forged documents. Mapped routes through Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, and beyond. Dr. Wright published her findings in 1951 in a groundbreaking book titled The Spider's Web: Women and the Underground Railroad. The book brought Martha's story to public attention for the first time. But the reaction was complicated. Many readers were troubled by Martha's methods. Yes, she'd saved 57 children, but she'd also murdered 3 men. She'd used poison, deception, and manipulation to achieve her goals. Broken every law of God and man. Could such a woman really be considered a hero? Others argued that Martha must be understood in context. Slavery was a monstrous evil protected by law. The men she killed were active participants in that evil, buying and selling children for profit. In a system where legal justice was impossible, perhaps extra-legal justice was the only option. The debate continues to this day. There are no simple answers to the questions Martha's life raises. No easy judgments about a woman who did terrible things for noble reasons. But one thing cannot be debated: 57 children lived because of Martha and Price. Those 57 children grew up to have families of their own. Their children had children. Grandchildren had grandchildren. Generation after generation spread across North America and beyond, building lives of freedom and dignity from the 19th century into the 20th and beyond. By some estimates, the descendants of those original 57 children now number in the thousands. They are teachers, doctors, lawyers, artists, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. Citizens of a nation that once considered their ancestors property. They are alive today because of choices made by a woman they never knew. In 1998, a team of researchers from the Smithsonian Institution conducted a comprehensive study of Underground Railroad survivors' descendants. Using historical records, DNA testing, and genealogical research, they traced family trees of escaped slaves who'd settled in Canada and the northern United States. Among the families studied were 17 that could be traced back to children saved by Martha and Price, 17 family lines beginning with a child smuggled out of slavery in Virginia, South Carolina, or Georgia between 1843 and 1859. The researchers located descendants and interviewed them about their history. Many had no idea their ancestors had been enslaved. Many had never heard of Martha and Price. But when shown the evidence, when told the story of how their great-great-great-grandparents were saved, they responded with overwhelming emotion. One woman, a 73-year-old retired nurse from Detroit, wept when she learned her ancestor had been a 9-year-old girl named Sarah, rescued from a Charleston slave compound in 1849. Her family had always wondered how they'd come to be in Canada, assumed their ancestors escaped on their own, running through swamps and forests to reach freedom. Now she knew the truth: a stranger risked everything to save a child she'd never met. That child grew up, married, had children, and passed down the gift of freedom through 5 generations. "I wish I could thank her," the woman said through tears. "Tell her what her sacrifice meant. My children are alive because of her. My grandchildren are alive because of her. Everything I have, everything I am exists because she chose to fight." The last confirmed sighting of Martha and Price occurred in December 1859, 1 month after her disappearance from Savannah. A conductor on the Underground Railroad in Ohio wrote a letter to a colleague in Pennsylvania describing a meeting with a mysterious white woman calling herself Mrs. Williams. The woman arrived at his safe house late at night, accompanied by 6 black children. She helped them settle in, made sure they had food and warm clothing, then prepared to leave. When the conductor asked where she was going, she smiled and said she had more work to do. "There are always more children," she said. "Always more souls to save." The conductor asked if she was afraid of being caught. She laughed. "I stopped being afraid a long time ago. The only thing I fear now is running out of time before I can help everyone who needs me." She left before dawn. The conductor never saw her again. He never learned her real name, but he remembered her words for the rest of his life, and wrote them down so others would remember too. We will never know what happened to Martha and Price after that December night in 1859. Where she went, how long she lived, whether she ever found peace. Her body was never found. Her grave, if she has one, remains unmarked and unknown. But in a sense, it doesn't matter where she ended up. What matters is what she left behind. Martha Ann Price was not a saint. She was a murderer. She killed 3 men with cold calculation and careful planning. Violated every legal and moral code of her society. Lied, manipulated, and deceived everyone around her for 18 years. But she also saved 57 children from lives of bondage. Gave them a chance at freedom when no one else would. Risked her own life again and again to rescue innocent souls from a system designed to crush them. History is rarely simple. Heroes are rarely pure. The same person who does terrible things can also do magnificent things. The same hands that deliver poison can also lift a child to safety. Martha understood this better than anyone. She knew exactly what she was, a killer, breaking every law that governed her world. And she did it anyway, because she believed some laws are meant to be broken. In her journal, in one of the final entries before she disappeared, Martha wrote a passage summarizing her philosophy. Not addressed to anyone in particular, a reminder to herself of why she did what she did. It reads: "They will call me a monster. Say I am a murderer, a demon, a creature without conscience or soul. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps I have become something terrible in my fight against something worse. But I think of the children. Isaiah and Sarah and Benjamin and all the others whose names I carry in my heart. I think of the lives they will live, the families they will raise, the futures they will build. And I know that whatever I have become, it was worth it. Every sin I have committed, every law I have broken, every night spent in fear and darkness, it was worth it because they are free. And as long as they are free, I have won." The Black Widow of 1859 counted the saved. Counted them one by one, keeping their names and stories close to her heart. She measured her life not by the husbands she killed, but by the children she rescued. Found redemption not in forgiveness, but in action, in the simple and terrible work of saving lives. The world called her a monster. History forgot her for nearly a century. Even now, her name is known only to a handful of scholars and researchers. But in Toronto and Detroit and Philadelphia and a dozen other cities, families exist because of her. Children playing in schoolyards, grandparents celebrating birthdays, parents watching their kids grow up, all alive because a woman they never knew made an impossible choice in 1843. She didn't ask for gratitude. Expect recognition. She did what she did because she believed it was right and accepted the consequences without complaint. That is her legacy. That is her gift to the world. 57 children, 57 lives, 57 threads in a tapestry of freedom stretching from the slave cabins of the Old South to the present day.